Yes, this is the story of how I acquired my Vauxhall 3098. Now, it must have been about 1965, and I was working at Vauxhall Motors. And I'd met up with a chap called Malcolm Preston, who was from Australia. And he was on secondment. Was what they used to do in those days was they used to send likely chaps around the world to work at various General Motors establishments, and he'd been working at Holden, and so they sent him to England to do a stint at Vauxhall Motors. Now, Malcolm and I became quite good friends, and what we used to do was because we were both interested in old motor cars, we used to travel down to the Vauxhall collection. They had a whole collection of old cars there. We used to go down to the collection and have a look at the cars and have a discussion about them. And one day I was with him and we went down to have a look at them, and I was looking at the Vauxhall 3098, which they'd had in the Vauxhall collection. And I said to him, Malcolm, I would really love to own one of these cars. And so he said to me, funnily enough, I happen to know where there might be one. So I said, well, that's interesting. Why don't we get a pool car out and go and visit and have a look at it? And he said, well, it's a hell of a long drive from here. It's in Australia. So that was put a bit of a damper on it. Anyway, he said, but I have a brother in Australia who's only known as Bro. And he was a typical Australian bushwhacker. And it reminded me of a story of when a couple of Australians were going around the bush, and they got to know each other reasonably well, and one of them used to say to the other, good morning, and then in the evening he used to say good night. And after about 3 months of this, and they were travelling around Australia, the original Australian said to the second guy, he said, I can't handle you anymore. He said, you talk too much. And that really sums up Bro. Now, Bro was a typical bushwhacking Australian, and they'd had Vauxhall 1440s together and made quite a good arrangement with those. But so anyway, so what we did was we rented a call. We fixed a call up from Vauxhall Motors and called his brother in Australia. And the conversation went something like this. I said to Bro, I understand you know there's a Vauxhall for sale in Australia. And he said, yes. So I said to him, I tell you what, I'll give you £600 landed in the UK. And he said, right, and put the phone down on me. Now, about 3 weeks later, I got a telegram back from Bro, and it simply said, no deal. So I rang him again, and I said to him, look, Bro, is that Vauxhall still for sale? And he said, yes. And I said, I'll give you £1,000 landed in the UK. And another 3 weeks went by, and I got another telegram, and it simply said, it's yours. And that was it. And that was the whole of the deal. It turned out that this car was in pieces. It had belonged to a chap called Taylor, who'd been running the car for a number of years, and he got it into quite a bad state and decided to try to restore it. But it had all got on top of him. And he'd given away, and he'd taken to the bottle. And so he'd given away bits of the car for bottles of booze. And it turns out that Bro had taken 3 months off work to go around Australia buying back the bits that Mr. Taylor had given away for bottles of booze. Plus the fact he'd also decided to put it into some sort of running order, and he'd rebored it and fitted Model A Ford pistons to it. Now, that was a bit of a problem because although they're the same bore size, 98mm bore, The trouble is that the Model A Ford pistons aren't any good because they come apart. They're only joined. The skirt is only joined to the top of the piston around the gudgeon pins, and if you rev them up, because a 3098 is a much more powerful car than a Model A Ford, the pistons fly apart, which is useless. So anyway, finally what happened was this car arrived on a ship from Australia, the SS Warunga, and it docked at Tilbury. And they unloaded the car, and I managed to persuade the local Vauxhall dealer to look after this car in his showroom until such time as we could collect it. And we went down with Ken Cook and myself, and we towed it back on a fixed tow bar with Ken at the wheel and me driving the tow car. We finally got it home, but it was in quite a bad state, to be honest with you. The body had been quite badly damaged, the windscreen had been cut off, and the tops of the doors were broken down, and various other things, and it was in quite a sorry state. But by the time we got it back, I started a business in Hitchin called Tuller Engineering. And we were restoring Bugattis for people like Nick Mason. And I persuaded them to take the body and restore the body, which they made a very good job of, I have to say, and reupholster it. And the upholsterer was known as John the Trim. And John the Trim was an excellent upholsterer and a wonderful hood maker. But that's another story. I'll get onto that later. But the chassis was quite bad. It had actually fractured through the chassis, almost through, where the spare wheel mounting went. So what I did was I took it to my workshop at home, and I rigged it up and put like a tourniquet across the chassis to line it up, and I welded it back into place. And it's stood the test of time because it's still there. It's still finally okay. And I fitted a new bracket for the spare wheel holder. But then I decided that we needed to get the engine running and so on. And I took it down to Arthur Archer's place in Dunmow, in Norfolk, and he rebuilt the engine for me at considerable expense, I have to add. And then we also found that the back axle needed some attention because the back axle has tubes on each side which run in trunnions, and it has a big aluminium casting which with a brass bush in the middle of it, and the ends of the axle run in these bushes. And what had happened was the Australians, they welded back and forth underneath where it was worn on the tube, and then filed it round so that it fitted into these trunnion blocks. But what they hadn't realised was that as you welded it back and forth, the axle distorted. And so, of course, it was in a bit of a parlous state when I got to it. But I managed to find from Alan Quatermain, who was also a Vauxhall man, just down the road from us, and he had some spare axle tubes which he let me have. So that solved that problem. So we were able to rebuild the back axle, and we were able to build up the cylinder block. And in the end, I put it all together, and it worked out, and it had a really nice motor car by the time I'd finished with it. But it took several years, I have to say, to build up this car, because I was working at Vauxhall's at the time. I wasn't being paid a lot of money, and so I had to spread the cost and the time over my spare time and so on, and it was a long job. But the other problem was that it had never been registered in the UK, because I didn't realise when I bought it that over half of the Vauxhall 3098s were actually sold in Australia, because the English couldn't afford them, but the wealthy sheep farmers and so on in Australia could afford them. And they'd had a very good agent out there, a chap called Boyd Edkins, who'd spent a lot of time doing transcontinental record-breaking runs. and he'd built up a hell of a reputation for Vauxhalls, so much so that they were very popular in Australia for the speed and the longevity of the cars. And this is another reason why they were so popular in Australia. But when it arrived, of course, I hadn't got a registration number for it. It'd never been registered in the UK. It went out there brand new. And I had a friend in Harpenden where I lived who had, one of his sons had an Austin 7, and its registration number was VV85. Now, this seemed an entirely suitable registration number for a Vauxhall Velox, as they were called. And so what I did was I bought the Austin 7 for £5. It was just a chassis, basically, with a body on it. And then I transferred the number over to the Vauxhall, and they issued a new number for the Austin 7, of which I still have the logbook, and that was 375WJH, which was a 1930 number, and the remains of the Austin 7 were then sold on for £5, so that the registration number didn't actually cost me anything at all. But from then on, it was registered as VV85, and due to as was done in the old days, the registration plate was cast in aluminium, and so I had cast aluminium plates made up and fitted to the front axle and the back of the car, and it was very appropriate because it really looked quite good with that number on, because it had a dash between the VV and the 85, and so I got pictures of it finished. Unfortunately, I don't have all the pictures that I have of it, because believe it or not, we're all packed up and waiting to go to Guyana. And so all the stuff that I've got about the car, other than these 3 pictures, are in my archives, which are on their way to Guyana at present, so I can't actually show them to you. But what I promise we'll do is, once we get there, I'll revive the whole story and print these pictures so you can see them. Because we've got pictures of it when it was arrived, and pictures of it being rebuilt, and so on and so on. And I had pictures of it when we took it to France. We took it to France on a couple of occasions. Once was to pick up some champagne from a vineyard where we'd bought a whole lot of champagne, and we loaded all these boxes of champagne on the back of the car on the luggage grid and drove it all the way home. It was quite an exciting trip. And on another occasion, I packed it all up with the whole family and took it all the way down to the Dordogne, and we had an interesting holiday there. And in fact, on one occasion, we were coming around Nice, I think it was, on the route périphérique, and I had an explosion and one of the back tires blew out, and I had a hell of a job changing the wheel at the side of the road, because every time I bent down, a bloody car came crashing by. But that was quite exciting, and I eventually got it back to the hotel, and we managed to change the tyre over, because it was only the inner tube that had gone. And I think what had happened was the pressure had gone down, and it had taken. What happens is with the beaded edge tyres is that when the pressure goes down, the outer tube, outer carcass of the tyre inches its way around and pulls the valve out of the tube. And so that's what had happened, I think. Anyway, we changed the tyre over, took it, and then I had to take it down to the local service station, and I asked them, well, where do they put the air in for the camion? And they took me around the back and showed me these pumps, which they used for pumping the tyres up on the lorries. And when I was pumping the tyres up, I need 80-pound pressure in the tyres, you see, to run it properly. I don't think these guys had ever seen a beaded edge tyre before. When I looked round, they were all cowering behind the pumps, expecting me to explode the whole thing in front of them. But anyway, that was another story. But we had lots of experiences with this Vauxhall, and eventually, I had it for 50 years, you know, and then eventually I sold it to Gregor Fiskin, when I came to America in 2014, because I couldn't really run it over here in America, because you can only do sort of 500 miles on a set of tyres, where they wear out so quick, because it's a very high-powered motor car, and the beaded edge tyres simply won't do the mileage. So if you wanted to go any distance, you'd have to buy a set of tyres to go there, another set of tyres when you got there, and another set of tyres on the way back. I mean, it'd be impossible. You simply couldn't run it in America, not with the mileage you have to do to get anywhere. And so I had to sell it, really, which was a great wrench for me, because I'd had this car all these years, and lots of exciting trips with it, and family and so on. But anyway, that's the story of how I acquired the Vauxhall, and how we sort of ran it, and how it went. And it's a lovely motor car. I mean, they are so powerful and so responsive, and they handle so beautifully. I can't imagine in a better vehicle other than an Austin 7 Chummy. So I was very happy with it, really. Just very sad I had to sell it. Anyway, that's the story of the Vauxhall, and thank you for listening. Cheers, bye-bye, good night.